We've recently been painting up some of the sub-faction Deimos for our Ad-Mech combat patrol. But for most of these models, we've used various different styles of paints from different brands. Predominantly, we've been using things like Vallejo, Monument Hobbies, and things like that. But what if you only happen to have a small selection of available paint ranges, potentially only having Citadel as your options of paints? Well, today we're going to be painting up the Skitarii that come in this box set, and we're only going to be using Citadel paints for this scheme and see if we can try and fit it in with the overall style of the rest of the models and find out if paint ranges actually matter. Starting from a zenithal prime, we can go to block out the main areas of brightness across all of our robes. This is where the zenithal really quite helps. We can essentially trace the whiter, brighter sections of the zenithal with our pale blue. This will naturally leave us with the shadowy areas unpainted. So to fix this, what we're going to do is grab a dark grey and then apply thin layers over these darker sections, which will result in us having a really nice map of the light and dark areas. This will give us the perfect base to work from when we start to wet blend on the robe. This will essentially entail us thinning down the two previously used colours, applying the grey first over the darker grey areas, and then coming in quickly and applying the lighter blue, mixing this on the model to give us a really nice smooth transition. It's worth noting that I tend to find that the dark grey in this mix tends to overpower the lighter blue more often. So what I like to do is put down the darker colour and then mix in the lighter blue, pulling more of the blue towards the outer lighter recesses. And this just helps to give us a slightly clearer colour and only a muddy transition as opposed to a overall muddy blue-grey result. We want that transition from the grey shadows up to those blue highlights. It's worth noting that there are products that we can get that can essentially help us with this. Things like acrylic retarder for acrylic paint. What that'll do is essentially really slow down the drying time, giving us more ability and time to work with our paints. However, we need to make sure that we don't add too much of that acrylic retarder, otherwise our paints will never dry. Once we've worked around the robes wet blending, we can start to smooth out those blends and transitions. First, what we need to do is thin down our dark grey and then lightly apply this over the areas where the grey mixed a little bit too much and turned a little too pale grey. Obviously, we can't just glaze the shadows though. So what we need to do is start to glaze in some highlights as well. As you may expect for this, we first need to take our pale blue and then use this as a glaze across the robes, hitting all of the lighter sections and the start of those transition points, bringing up the brightness and the clarity of that overall pale blue colour. From there, we can choose to add a little bit of a pale blue-grey, desaturating our initial blue, and then we can go round and repeat this in a more narrowed and focused manner, targeting the centre of any billowing robes and any sharp folds. Finally, we can finish this off by thinning down just the pale grey blue that we were using in the mix, and then glaze this across the sharpest edges of the robes and any bits near the hem that will give us a nice clear boundary line. These glazes should quite quickly bring up the brightness while also maintaining that blue hue that we want so that it is in keeping with the rest of the models that we've already painted. With that said, we've now finished the outside robes. So it's time to move to the inner robes as well as all of the inner fabrics and clothing. This is where we are going to be departing from the main scheme as it officially kind of has a pale white blue inner cloak as well as on the outer cloak. Whereas what we're doing is we're going for red, the same as some of the other fabrics on the clothing. For this, we're going to take a dark red contrast and apply it over all of our chosen areas, before we then grab a brighter red layer paint and then work around picking out all of those raised billowing sections of any of the robes as well as any sharp folds, giving us a nice bright highlight on our foot soldiers. It is also worth discussing that you may have noticed in the footage that we are actually painting these guys in sub-assemblies. These Skitarii actually handle sub-assemblies a lot better than the flying Skitarii that were quite a nightmare to deal with. The advantage of these guys is we can kind of build the top half and the bottom half. And what that means is we can pop the top off of the bottom, so we can paint the legs and the feet as well as the inside and back of the cloak without risking getting any of the paints in the wrong places. The same thing with any of the arms that had machine guns across the chest. I didn't want to have it blocked, so we used blue tack to pin the arms on at the shoulders, allowing us just to whip that off Backpack as well, little bit of blue tack holding it in, meaning we have full access to the back of the robe when we're painting that section. Overall, I quite like working in sub-assemblies, and for something like this, it seemed not too much hassle and added a lot of flexibility, though there are areas that I clearly painted that now they're all fully put back together, you can't see. The other element that we need to paint is the lining of the robe. So this is where it goes down and essentially folds over onto the other side on the inside of the model. I found the easiest way of doing this is by having it in sub-assemblies. We're able to take the legs away and we can come in from the inside to the out, scraping through. What this tended to do was leave less of the overspill going onto the outside white that we've spent ages painting, and it meant that any build-up that was on the inside of the model is where the red paint is anyway, and is less likely to be seen because it's the feet of the robes. Whereas if we don't have it in sub-assembly, we've got to come in from outside in, which may result in getting a little bit more of extra spillage. It's worth just noting that if it's possible, try and do it so that you're coming from where the red already is, and hopefully you'll have less overspill. This sorts out the majorities of the fabric, so we can turn to the other elements, things like parchment, metals, leather. All of these are going to get the same quick brown contrast base, and this will work really nice for all of those elements. From there, we can start to split out and tackle each area independently. The metals have a lot of layers and a lot of stages, so we can kick some of them off now and then come back to them later. The first is we're going to be taking a dark brown metallic paint, and then we can use this to overbrush all of the metal areas, giving us a nice shine in a very similar color to our base coat brown. So from there, what we want to do is then add a little bit more overbrushing, but this time we're going to grab a slightly lighter, warmer, bronzier tone. Ideally, this will help to give a rough, aged feel to all of the base metals, which we can then build upon in future steps. We need to let all of the metals dry before we come back and start layering more layers on top of them. However, we've still got some elements to do, so we'll tackle them while we wait. And those are things like the pipes, the hands that are not metal, and any smaller areas that we don't really want to draw attention to. For those, I tend to like using Black Legion. If we want, we can just do one coat, and if the contrast gives us a nice effect, we can keep it. But what we also did here is come in with a quick highlight later on, using a pale yellow, coming in and overbrushing and slightly dry brushing those areas to bring up that brightness a little bit. And that sets us up nicely for work later on. It's also worth noting that there are things like purity seals on this model. I used contrast for those, but I don't have a green contrast still, so I just mixed up one from my blue and my yellow contrast, giving us a green contrast that I could just stick over all of those purity seals. Jumping back to the metals, we are going two ways from here, one towards a silver and then the other towards a gold. Kicking off with the latter, we want to grab a bright, warm gold paint and then use this to lightly overbrush all of the areas that we're going to be targeting. On these Skitaris, that's going to include the metal body parts, the face plates, and things like the weapons and the backpack. Whereas for the first steps of things like the armor and the helmet, what we are going to do is take a mild silver and then work across layering this up on the main sections, leaving the bronze work that we did earlier in predominantly the recesses. This will naturally both need to be highlighted. So what we're going to do is grab a brighter version of each of those paints, getting a bright silver and a bright gold, and then essentially repeat the last set of steps in a narrower, more focused area, and then follow up with a quick edge highlight using these colors to give all of those metals a nice bright pop of shine. I'm aware that in the Adeptus Mechanicus book, the photo we've got of the models has red armor, and that is very similar to what we've done to models like our horsemen. They have shiny red metal armor. However, we used a actual red metal for this, and Games Workshop have decided in their infinite wisdom that we only need gold, silvers, bronzes, and the traditional metal tones. We don't get any fun metallic colors that I'm aware of. So what we're going to need to do is actually essentially make our own a little bit, which we can do by taking some contrast and a little bit of contrast thinner and get to work glazing. Once we have sufficiently thinned our red contrast with roughly an even amount of contrast thinner to our contrast red, we can start to glaze this thinned red contrast across all of the metal areas that we have painted silver but wanted to be red. This will be things like the metal helmet, the chest plate, as well as any of the leg and shin guards. This is where the contrast is actually really helpful because one, it naturally tints our metals, but also it acts slightly like an oil wash in the sense of we don't need to make sure that we touch every single area. What we can do is kind of drop it in, pull it around, and capillary action pulls it into those recesses while still staining those top areas. And we don't get that function in another way. We could, for example, take our metals that we are using and mix the red contrast in, but we would lose that ability of it acting like a contrast. The same as you might lose your mind if you look down and realize you haven't actually subscribed to the channel yet for some reason. So why not fix that? That, however, only sorts out the red metals. So what we need to do is come back and deal with the rest of the metals using a few different washes. We can start off with a flesh wash, and this can be applied over all of the gold metals. This will add some detail recess shading as well as a little bit of warmth at the same time. Then we have all of the black areas as well as anything that is still silver, which might be things like the dangly bits on backpacks as well as belt buckles. These are going to get a black wash. Finally, we can take a thinned blue contrast. And then what we want to do is apply this across all of the power related sections on the backpacks and the guns. These power cell rings will hold that contrast nicely. This is essentially where the Citadel aspect ends because they don't really have a product that will do what we need to do. And this is kind of a bonus stage. And that is we're going to be taking some oils and some oil thinner in a brighter shade than we've used so far for all of our power elements. And we're going to be applying this to give us a bright power cell effect. Once we thin down our blue oil paint with a little bit of oil thinner, we can apply a dab of this with a paintbrush to all of the power areas that we previously hit with the blue contrast. This oil wash should quickly seep into all of the recesses and then sit nicely on top in a narrow band around the dark blue contrast areas we applied earlier. This, once dry, should really help to sell that brighter blue core radiating out light. It's worth pointing out that oil paints in general do take quite a while to dry, and that can vary depending how much you've thinned them down. So just bear that in mind. Don't go in, touch them a little bit too early because you can still pull paint up, even up to 24, 48 hours after, depending how much you've thinned them. It's also worth saying that really if you're using things like oil paints, get a set of brush specific for using oil paints or specific to you for using them. They don't have to be specifically for oil paints. Just don't use your prime brush that you use for painting all the time with a really nice point because the oils will butcher them basically. They are really good at soaking up with capillary action, which is what we like with the effect we use on the model. However, that obviously goes the other way on the brush and it soaks in and can very easily set and cause a lot of damage. Yes, we can go in and clean them, but some of the cleaning products for oils can also be harmful to natural hairbrushes and help them wear out. So just bear that in mind. Potentially have a set of cheap brushes that you're happy just to throw away if they get mangled by an oil wash. With the tangent about oil washes done, however, let's look at how the models came out. Overall, I do quite like these. Yes, there are a few things that we've had to sacrifice due to the Citadel range limitations. I've noticed that next to the other models, the pale blue is more of the white tone that we actually used on the inside robe of our horsemen, as opposed to a slightly punchier blue that they are here. I could have possibly fixed that by starting from a darker bluer tone and then blending up, but lessons learned. Overall though, I do quite like them. I think the red came out quite nice, even though there is a little bit of shine loss compared to our other troops. But overall, that's just my opinions. I'm the one that spent the time painting them. So predominantly, I'm going to sit there and go, I like the models because I've got that time investment. You've invested the time in this video. So let me know, do you like this video? But more importantly, what do you think the models came out like? Do you think the models came out well and fit in with the rest of the models that we've painted? Do you have any paint ranges that you don't often see, would like to see more of, and things like that? We've actually done a video where we painted up the Grey Knights Combat Patrol, and we painted up predominantly all of those things using the Robeson liquid metal paint range, which isn't actually targeted at hobbyists, but give us a large range of fun metallic paints to work with. So if you want to see us use them, check out this video here. Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.